To the people of Brazil, you have a great opportunity to re-elect a fantastic leader, a fantastic man, one of the great presidents of any country in the world, President Bolsonaro. He has taken your country to great heights, and again, your country is now respected because of him all over the world. I'm very sorry to say this, that Brazil is doing poorly and will continue to do poorly. They can only do well when they're working with us. Without us, they will fail, just as others have failed. It's true. I was walking in and the leader of Brazil was walking out. We saw him and I saw him, he saw me, and we embraced. And then I'm saying, can you believe I'm going to be saying this in just 2 minutes? But we actually agreed that we would meet next week. We didn't have much time to talk, like about 20 seconds. They were in retrospect, I'm glad I waited because this thing didn't work out too well. But we did talk, we had a good talk, and we agreed to meet next week, if that's of interest. But he seemed like a very nice man, actually. He liked me, I liked him. But if you, and I only do business with people I like. When I don't like them, I don't like them. But we had, at least for about 39 seconds, we had excellent chemistry. It's a good sign.
Milan ou Tripoli, Vilnius ou Benghazi, Paris, Moscou, on fait le bunga, bunga, Bangkok ou Bogota, Le Caire ou Jakarta, Gustavia, on fait le bunga, bunga.
Hello everyone, welcome back to BungaCast, the global politics podcast at the end of history. And this is our end of September episode. Today we're going to talk about US-Brazil relations and the links between Bolsonarismo and MAGA. And then we'll reflect on the global nature of the radical right before the usual end-of-month letters to the editor. Joining me today will be Bunga boy George Hoare and contributing editor Ryan Zickgraf. But before all that, I'm going to speak with Guilherme Casarões, Associate Professor of Brazilian Studies at Florida International University, who's an expert on the global far right and on Brazilian foreign policy. So, this year there's been a sequence of tensions between Lula's Brazil and Trump's USA, a story that serves as a bit of a case study on the radical right and its globalized nature. Let me just recap events relating to Brazil-US relations from the past year. After Jair Bolsonaro lost his re-election bid in October 2022, his supporters attacked the buildings of the Supreme Court, the Congress, and the Presidential Palace in an attempt to instigate a military coup and reinstate Bolsonaro as president. It looked a little bit like the US's January the 6th, but the threat of a coup was much more genuine. Bolsonaro had gone to the US shortly before these events, but according to documents and pleas by allies, Bolsonaro and his gang had plotted a coup and were only unsuccessful because the military top brass did not go along with the scheme. After losing his political rights in 2023, Bolsonaro was sentenced to 27 years in jail on September 11th of all days this year. Bolsonaro and his co-defendants argued that they weren't successful in mounting a coup, that it was only words, and therefore these actions did not count as a coup attempt, which is a bit like saying an attempted murder shouldn't face repercussions because you're a mediocre murderer. Bolsonaro's sentencing is a landmark. Brazil has suffered multiple coups throughout its history, all of which have either proven successful or seen its perpetrators amnestied afterwards. There was never any sort of real reckoning with those responsible for the last coup in 1964, for example. In July of this year, Trump sought to interfere in this whole process by announcing a 50% tariff on Brazilian imports. Central to the whole MAGA accusation against Brazil has been the role of the Supreme Court, and particularly Justice Alexandre de Moraes, who has emerged as possibly the most powerful figure in Brazil over the past 5 years. He's undoubtedly overstepped his bounds in numerous ways, such as mandating that some leading pro-Bolsonaro social media accounts be taken down. The U.S. has consequently imposed Magnitsky Act sanctions, which involve visa withdrawals, freezes on U.S.-held assets, and so on, against Brazilian officials, including Supreme Court justices. Bolsonaro's third son, Congressman Eduardo Bolsonaro, spent the early part of this year in the U.S. on leave from Congress, coordinating sanctions against his own country, something for which he's now being investigated. So, fast forward to this week, Trump officials announced new sanctions against Brazilian authorities, and then the following day, at the UN, on Tuesday the 23rd of September, Lula hailed the sentencing of Bolsonaro and argued that all around the world, anti-democratic forces are trying to subjugate institutions and suffocate freedoms. They worship violence, glorify ignorance, act as physical and digital militias, and restrict the press. Moreover, he stated that there is no justification for unilateral and arbitrary measures against our institutions and our economy. Aggression against the independence of the judiciary is unacceptable. Right after, still at the UN, Trump accused Brazil of censorship, repression, judicial corruption, and the targeting of political critics. But right after, he said that Lula was a nice guy in the clip that you heard at the start. So to talk a little bit more about this, let me welcome Guilherme Casarões. Okay, Guilherme, so let's start with the tariffs. I mean, Trump's tariffs on Brazil are obviously politically motivated. Is there any economic rationale whatsoever behind them?
Well, in a way there is, if you think about it, because, Trump is a protectionist and he really wants to, bring industries back to the United States. So in this sense, if you consider that Brazil's exports to the United States are mostly comprised of manufactured products, from auto parts to, ground coffee to bottled orange juice at times. So in many ways, it's a way to reinforce the American industrial sectors. But on the other hand, most of the tariffs that he has imposed on other countries has been justified on the grounds that America has trade deficits with those countries. And in Brazil's case, this is definitely not correct. Because after all, Brazil carries large deficits in its trade with the United States, and it has carried for, maybe a couple decades now. So from this purely trade perspective, there's no reason to over-tariff Brazil as Trump has done. But again, there are some very key industrial sectors that Brazil competes directly with the United States, and maybe Trump wants to, preserve and reinstate these factories back in the United States. So that can be one reason. But in Brazil's case, also, it's not just about tariffs. He sent a letter to President Lula on the 9th of July saying that he was imposing 50% of tariffs on Brazil. But he also launched, at pretty much the same time, a thorough investigation on Brazil's alleged unfair trade practices. So there was a lot of different sectors. There were many sectors of Brazil's technology and of Brazil's, environmental policies that are currently also under investigation. So Trump has basically used two different tools to coerce Brazil. And again, I agree with you. It's totally a politically motivated decision, but the tools were twofold. Number one, the tariffs, and number two, investigations based on Section 301 of the United States Trade Act of the 1970s, 1974. So in a way, there's a lot of pressure being put on Brazil because of these decisions and because of the investigation. And there's another element to that which might explain Trump's rationale. Trump is a 19th century man in so many ways. He envisions an international order which is pretty much like the one we used to have back in the late 19th century, which is basically the world ruled by just a small number of great powers.
Yeah.
And these great powers, they establish their own spheres of influence on their own regions mostly. So I feel that as opposed to American hegemony, which basically meant that the United States would be in charge of the entire world, what we see now is Trump being okay with China having its own sphere of influence in Asia. He seems to be fine with Russia having its own sphere of influence around Eastern Europe. But at the same time, Trump really wants to move into Latin America, to reclaim Latin America or the Americas as a hemisphere as part of the United States sphere of influence, classic sphere of influence. It goes back to the to the 1800s, right? The Monroe Doctrine, for example, of 1824, that stated that America was for the Americans. So one of the things about Brazil is that Brazil is a gateway for Chinese investments and for Chinese trade into Latin America. So by putting a lot of pressure on Brazil, maybe what Trump wants, and this is the long shot, of course, is to kick China out of Latin America by kicking China out of Brazil in the first place. The problem right now is that the strategy it seems to have backfired, in the sense that, well, China and Brazil are closer now than ever before.
Yeah, and these tariffs have fortified these links, right? I mean, I think a lot of Brazilian exports still found buyers because it went to other buyers other than the U.S. since these sanctions have been imposed.
Yeah, Brazil has rushed to diversify its export markets. Of course, China is not the only buyer, because China doesn't really buy manufactured products from Brazil. It buys mostly agricultural commodities. So, in the sense, it's not that Brazil is going to replace its trade with the United States, which accounts for roughly 12% of Brazil's trade volume. It's not going to replace this trade with China, of course, because the Chinese are buying some other things. But at the same time, it kind of pushes Brazil to this position of trying to diversify its partners, which in many ways is a good thing.
Yeah, I've been taken aback by this whole spate of kind of tensions between the U.S. and Brazil, but mostly, I think, because I had the sense that Trump didn't really care about Brazil. Even when Bolsonaro was in office, I got the sense that Trump was pretty disdainful of Bolsonaro, so even just on a kind of personal level, and it wasn't particularly key in a lot of Trump MAGA thinking. And so to have emerged as one of the key kind of points of tension has caught me a little bit by surprise. Maybe this is just me. What do you think?
Well, Trump really doesn't care about people, individuals in particular. So it's not about Bolsonaro, but about what he represents. So in many ways, Bolsonaro tried to demonstrate, while he was the president of Brazil, he tried to show off his love for Trump. He even said it once. I think it was on the margins of the UN General Assembly back in 2019. He said, "I love you, Trump." And of course, Trump didn't say anything back. It's in many ways the same with Javier Milei in Argentina, right? So this is the kind of behavior, loyalty, or a desperate attempt to show off loyalty to Trump, that Trump likes. So it's not about the person, it's about the kinds of bonds these people can establish with the United States, or the kinds of commitments, ideological commitments included, that these people can have with the United States and with Trump's White House. Now, I personally think that when it comes to Brazil, I agree with you. When Trump got elected last November, a lot of analysts in Brazil would say, well, I don't think we're in trouble because Trump doesn't really care about Brazil. His priorities are, Venezuela and Panama and Greenland and Canada and some other things. I beg to differ. And back then I was kind of, I was anxious about what could happen, because I knew for a fact, and there are two things that we must understand about this new Trump administration. On the one hand, it seems to be much more ideological than his first term in office, right? Because now Trump is pretty much unchecked. He's got the majority of both House and Senate. He's got the majority of the Supreme Court. So in many ways, he's much freer right now to move forward with his, Project 2025 agenda. So because it's more ideological, of course, it's interesting for Trump to secure or to reinstate, in some cases, some of the allies or former allies that he used to have 6 years ago. And that's the case of Bolsonaro. Of course, Brazil under Bolsonaro would be entirely subservient to the United States. So that is seen as a good thing by the Trump administration, of course, especially because there's this China factor, which is part of the calculation. And there's something else about the new Trump administration that is, or used to be, the role of Elon Musk. Musk, as the head of Doge, but even before that, as one of the biggest funders of the Trump campaign in 2024, Musk had been in a very serious fight with one Supreme Court justice in Brazil called Alexandre de Moraes. This is because the Brazilian judiciary wanted X, or the former Twitter platform, to comply with some Brazilian legislations that regulates the nature of the speech, the online speech that X was sending out. So the idea that there's a judge in Brazil, there's a Supreme Court justice who's not really interested in hate speech, especially far-right hate speech that has taken over X ever since Elon Musk got hold of it, that led to a big fight between Musk and Alexandre de Moraes. And I used to see when Trump got elected that there could be some sort of personal vendetta between Elon Musk and Moraes. And if you look at where things are now, of course, Bolsonaro is a relevant part of this entire conversation. I mean, we have one of his sons, one of Bolsonaro's sons, Eduardo Bolsonaro, who's a congressman, and he's been in the United States for many months now, and he's actively lobbying for the White House to sanction Brazil, to sanction Moraes, to impose tariffs on the country.
So let me just ask you on that, because that was my next question. What has Eduardo Bolsonaro's role been, and what's his story? Could you tell us a little bit how he came to become the point man for Brazilian links to MAGA, not just to the Trump administration, but I think probably to the wider movement?
Awesome. So let me just take a step back and mention Elon Musk's role in all that. I think that in many ways, Brazil has always been on the radar of the new White House because of Elon Musk's grudges with Justice Alexandre de Moraes. And that seems to me to be the greatest element, the most important element of all that. You see, Trump spoke at the United Nations General Assembly on Tuesday, and he said that the problem about Brazil was not so much about the political persecution against Bolsonaro, but it was about censoring freedom of speech from American citizens and American companies alike. So the point is more related, I think, to the big tech lobby than to the Bolsonaro lobby. But okay, Eduardo Bolsonaro has become one of the most important, if not the most important, far-right politician in Brazil. And many people underestimate his role because they, make fun of his English, which is not perfect, but it's fine. I mean, he can get around with his English. Eduardo Bolsonaro, he's a congressman, and he was elected for the first time back in 2014 as part of the Bolsonaro franchise, because that was one of the plans of then Congressman Jair Bolsonaro to elect his own kids, to make sure it was a family business, pretty much. And Eduardo Bolsonaro is the youngest of the three sons that he has that are in politics. Well, there's a fourth son right now who's a city councilor in Balneário Camboriú in the deep south of Brazil. But basically, Eduardo Bolsonaro was the most outspoken, let's say, representative of the Bolsonarista movement ever since he was founded. He was not really established at any point in time, but as the movement was becoming stronger, Eduardo Bolsonaro has always been a very outspoken voice. And, his actions and his words caught the eye of Steve Bannon very early on, back in 2018. There is another person to the story, which is Felipe Martins, who was the former international politics advisor to Bolsonaro. Felipe Martins and Eduardo Bolsonaro very early on started to, get along with Steve Bannon, and they started to, take pictures together. They started to align their own rhetoric about what was going on in Brazil. So the fact that Eduardo Bolsonaro became very close to Steve Bannon sort of allowed Eduardo to become the spokesperson in Brazil of a bigger far-right initiative, a bigger far-right movement. So he was invited back in 2019 to become the Latin American representative to Bannon's group, The Movement, that was established in Europe at the time. Eduardo Bolsonaro is the man who articulates the relationship between the Brazilian far-right and the South American far-right, or even Latin America if we include Mexico. So he became very close to Maria Corina Machado in Venezuela. He became very close to some Colombian far-right politicians. He became close to José Antonio Cast in Chile, to Javier Milei, of course, in Argentina. So he was the builder of this very meaningful South American far-right platform early on, I mean, as early as 2019. And in 2020, he moved on to establish the Madrid Forum with some Ibero-American politicians, which includes the Vox party in Spain and the Chega party in Portugal as well. So it's interesting to see that Eduardo Bolsonaro is not only a very important politician for Bolsonarismo as a movement at home, but he has also become the transnational link between several different far-right movements from across the world. And naturally, the most important of these movements abroad is the Trumpist movement. So Eduardo Bolsonaro has also developed very close ties through Bannon and then through some other politicians. Congress people in the US, for example, became very close to Eduardo Bolsonaro. And that has allowed him to put a lot of pressure on the House, in particular, to start the sanctions against Alexandre de Moraes. So even before Trump got elected, Eduardo Bolsonaro was already here in the United States lobbying for sanctions against Brazilian justices or against the Brazilian government. So he's a very key piece in all this, transnational network that has been established since, or that was established back in 19, and that has been very powerful. That has become very powerful ever since then.
Yeah, so I should probably just give note right now to the fact that there's, in terms of political symbolism at least, the Brazilian left has now been able to kind of re-embrace the Brazilian flag, which the right has made its symbol, particularly since around 2015 onwards. So in protest this month in Sao Paulo, there was a big US flag at a pro-Bolsonaro demonstration, which actually prompted quite a bit of outrage. And now there's been a response from protests organized by the left against amnesty for Bolsonaro, and as well as against a kind of law which would basically provide for greater corruption. And that kind of featured a large Brazilian flag. So there's an interesting backdrop to this in terms of the way that national symbols are being played with, but also in terms of who positions themselves as the nationalist and the sovereigntist versus who is the sort of globalist or internationalist. And it's in fact the right which emerges as in some ways the one which is most committed to forging these links between radical right forces across borders. I wanted to ask specifically whether Bolsonarismo, in your view, is the closest to MAGA amongst the global radical right. I mean, to the extent that we can compare these things. I've often made the point, and regular listeners to this podcast will know, that I've always been dismissive of this idea of Trump of the tropics as a moniker given to Bolsonaro, that the contextual differences are so significant that it makes little sense to just say Bolsonaro is just like Trump, or indeed that Bolsonaro merely imitates Trump. But at the same time, one can't avoid the fact that there has been quite a lot of influence and imitation. I think you've talked about the relationship between Bolsonarismo and MAGA as emulation, articulation, and internalization. So maybe you could explain this for us.
Right. Unfortunately, the original article is in Portuguese, so I assume that not everyone will be able to read it. But I've been also talking about this in some English outlets, so maybe listeners are going to find some very interesting things about this. Trumpism in the Tropics is meant to be the title of my forthcoming book. So I personally think that even though there are differences, and there are many, I mean, from party politics, I mean, Brazil has 35 different political parties represented in Congress, while the United States has only 2. The role of the military, the role of the Catholic Church, the nature of the left in both countries is very different. So even though there are differences, I think that one thing that we must acknowledge is the fact that there would hardly be a Bolsonarista movement in Brazil without Trumpism, in the sense that what Trumpism gave the Bolsonaro family was a blueprint, a playbook, and that has worked. Well, to the point that Bolsonaro got elected back in 2018. So one of my claims, one of my big hypotheses, if I could put it this way, is that, well, Brazilians have, a lot of Brazilians are conservative folks, right? So it's not that conservatism uh, wasn't there and all of a sudden Brazil became a conservative country. This is not the case. But right wing politicians have never been able to tap into people's conservative identities. So the discussion, the conversation in Brazil, especially when it comes to elections, has mostly been about policy, not about identity. And Bolsonaro was the first mainstream politician or an outsider who suddenly became mainstream back in 18 to tap into people's identities and, of course, fears and hate and anxieties by and large. So um, Bolsonaro has never been really a pious kind of person. So he was not into religion. The first time he spoke of God in a major speech in Congress was probably 2015 or 16, even though he's been around since the 1990s. So what I think Trump gave Bolsonaro was the sense, I mean, in very broad strokes, that an outsider can promote himself as the savior of a country, as Trump did in the US back in 15 and 16. And after that, I mean, when Trump really got elected in 2016, I think that a lot of politicians in Brazil looked around and thought, well, I think we can do a very similar thing here. I think we can build on the narratives that Trump has, come up with, and we can advance them, of course, translating them into the Brazilian reality, adapting them to, the circumstances of the country, which are very different. And they made it. So I think that's the thing. The playbook has worked, and if you you know if you look at if you try to X-ray the logic of Trumpism as a movement, and if you put it side by side with the Bolsonaro movement, they are indeed very similar. And it's interesting because while I do research on the far right since, I don't know, 2016 or 2017, even before Bolsonaro was elected. And one thing that really strikes me is that, for example, the European far right is very different from the US far right. You don't find a lot of religion, especially in Western European far right movements, with maybe the exception of Vox in Spain, which is very Catholic. The notion of immigration is actually different between European far right parties and Trumpism. So I would say that Brazil and the United States are actually, the movements are actually very similar to one another. And I have decomposed the Brazilian far-right movement, or Bolsonarismo, into four different parts. So part number one is what I call digital Templars, which are, the Deus Vult kind of people who went online with a lot of memes, a lot of trolling, a lot of very radical rhetoric, right? It's the alt-right in the United States, and in many ways it has become an element, a piece of the Brazilian far-right as well. And of course, Steve Bannon and Brazil's, or Bolsonaro's guru, Olavo de Carvalho, who passed away in 22. I mean, these people are very strongly linked to this digital world and how to, shape narratives that grow from, Twitter and WhatsApp and so on and so forth. So that's one strand of the Bolsonarista movement, which is actually very similar to the alt-right. And then there's a second movement, which is the patriot pastors. Basically, what we have seen in Brazil, and that's a major demographic change, is the rise of evangelical Christianity in Brazil, as opposed to Catholicism. Brazil is a majority Catholic country. But ever since the 1980s, we've seen the growth of evangelical movements, especially Pentecostal and neo-Pentecostal movements that have, now they account for some 30% of the Brazilian population, and they have also become very actively politically. So now there's this Bible caucus in the Brazilian Congress with over 200 representatives. So that's a really big deal.
And it's probably even worth adding on to that even though the expected growth of the evangelical population hasn't exactly manifested according to the latest census, the fact that it's been able to become a major organizing political pole in the country actually speaks to its power, despite the fact that demographically it's significant, of course, but less than perhaps was expected. Nevertheless, it remains very powerful.
You're right, and yet we're talking about 60 million people in the country, so that's a big number. And the political power of many evangelical leaders, that's a very meaningful change in Brazilian politics, especially over the last 30 years. And they emulate, speaking of the steps, they pretty much emulate every single talking point from the Christian right in the United States, from pro-life positions to, anti-LGBT policies to, anti-drug policies. So they are they look up to what evangelicals in the United States have done and are still doing, and they basically reproduce these elements. A third pillar is the libertarians, the tropical libertarians, which is basically a group of many different movements and institutes that have been established over the last 20 years and that replicate the libertarian thinking of, Herman Hoppe and Rothbard and Ludwig von Mises. And they also love the far right, not because of the social conservatism that they stand up for, but mostly because of their economic policies. And they are against the state as much as Bolsonarism also seems to be against the state, even though it's profoundly authoritarian as well. And fourthly, there's a group that I call conservatives in arms, which is basically those folks who really want to stand up for the Second Amendment of the United States, which is kind of crazy because our Constitution says otherwise. It's a very different reality when it comes to gun control in Brazil and the United States. But the curious thing about it is that I've found evidence that ever since the 1990s, the National Rifle Association has been lobbying very strongly to ban gun control policies in Brazil. And now they have voices in Congress. Now they have a very strong platform. So in a nutshell, if you think about the bulk of the Trumpist movement, it's pretty much about Christian right-wing folks, those digital trolls that have come up after Breitbart and Steve Bannon, the libertarians, the likes of Elon Musk or Kash Patel or some others, and the Second Amendment folks. So Brazil emulates this structure to the to the deepest talking points and to the most important elements of their conservative agenda. Now, it's not just about imitation, as you said, it's also about networking. So it's most of these movements, they have been either funded by or they have received political support from groups from the United States. That's also a very important thing. So they're not just repeating what American far-right movements are saying. They are basically getting the help, the financial support, and the political legitimacy coming also from the United States. So that's very important because, well, sometimes we call these movements anti-democratic. Sometimes we criticize them for being, authoritarian. And one of the things they're going to reply to us is, well, the United States, which is the greatest democracy in the world, even though we know that, well, nowadays it's facing a lot of challenges, the United States has the same structure, so why won't we? So it's interesting because legitimacy also comes from the outside in. So that's a very important.
Well, so I wanted to ask and drill a little bit further into that last point there, because it's, as I hinted at, there's a very kind of globalist sort of orientation to the radical right, to Bolsonaristas in particular, and indeed what we call in Brazil viralatismo or mongrel dog syndrome, which is to kind of do down one's own country and look abroad to maybe Europe and especially nowadays to the US as the model for everything. And, you can have the same thing in the US as you have in Brazil, and the US version is always treated as marvelous, whereas the Brazilian one is terrible and decadent and so on. That sort of understanding, I think, raises questions about the type of nationalism represented by Bolsonarismo, and not just its nationalism domestically, but its nationalism in its foreign policy. So there's something which are very contradictory here. And you've written also about the way that what might come after the liberal international order, as more and more governments across the West and indeed beyond become led by forces of the radical right and what that will look like. And what do you see as Brazil's contribution to that under the first Bolsonaro government? And indeed, if there is to be a kind of Bolsonaro government that follows Lula, I mean, that's a big question mark. Of course, I don't want to presume too much, but, perhaps led by São Paulo Governor Tarcísio de Freitas.
Yes. Well, that's a great question. And let me unpack it in two parts. So the point number one is nationalism, even though it's a very strong element of the rhetoric of most of these movements from all over the world, it's not necessarily, and I'm going to say something that might sound weird to those who are listening to us, it's not nation-based nationalism. So nationalism, ever since the 19th century up until, yesterday, it used to be something about, the boundaries and the people and the greatness of the people, the moral or, ethnical superiority of groups. So that's one thing. What we have seen over the last decade or so is the rise of a different type of nationalism that we can label as religious nationalism. So it's no longer bound by, the national borders of a country. It's something greater than that. The Brazilian and the US version of this religious nationalism is, of course, Christian nationalism. So that's a very important point, because Christian nationalism basically tells you that you can only be an American or you can only be a Brazilian as long as you have some religious creed, as long as you have faith, as long as you are a Christian, pretty much. And this is interesting because in many ways it's religion, not nationalism per se, that justifies the cooperation between so many different groups from across the world. We see, for example, and under Bolsonaro, we have seen Brazil and India coming together on a very weird rhetoric of religious nationalism. And that was interesting because, of course, Brazil and India, they have so much in common, even though they are like 10,000 miles apart. But at the same time, it was Hindu nationalism on the one hand, Modi's in Hindu nationalism, and Bolsonaro's Christian nationalism that brought them together. And that justified this, relationship between the two leaders at the time. And we have evidence for that. I mean, the former Brazilian foreign minister wrote about this, about the connections between Hinduism and Christianity and how they should come together to change the world and to envision a different international order and so on and so forth. Now, religious nationalism is one part of this story. The other part of the story is, what kind of road do far-right politicians and movements envision? I think that we have to differentiate between two things. There's populism and far-right or right-wing politics. These things have very often come together in recent years. But you can have populists from the left as well. You can have authoritarian populists on the left, like Nicolás Maduro in Venezuela, right? So there are some elements of this new international order that we may call a populist international order that they appear in the speeches of both left and right populists. So they are basically anti-multilateralism because they feel that, they lose power in as much as they let everyone make decisions on their own behalf. They prefer, for example, small-sized alliances like VIP clubs here and there. So this is one thing. They do not really like the idea of the rule of international law, which is something that the United Nations, for example, represents very strongly, because they think that national legislation is the most important thing for a country, not international legislation. So they want to shun all the international law from their own countries. And they are also very personalistic in the sense that they think that the legacy of the future is based on their own role and maybe their civilizational mission or something like that. So that's present in both left and right populisms. What's new and very distinct about the far right and the way it sees the world is that it's pretty much an ethno-nationalist platform. It's okay to be from different races as long as you go back to your own countries, as long as you don't bother us. So immigration is the problem. People flowing across borders is the problem, not the fact that people are different. So they are okay with the idea of several civilizations. As Samuel Huntington wrote about back in the 1990s, it's okay to have a lot of different civilizations in the world as long as they are bound by the same values and as long as they don't try to impose their own values onto other civilizations. So that's a very strong thing. Now, if you think about Bolsonaro's slogan, and let me finish with this. Ever since the campaign of 2018, but even more so after COVID, it's God, nation, or the fatherland, family, and freedom. And what's interesting about this is that even though nation is a very unique element of any nationalist movement, because after all, it's about their own nation, you see that God, family, and especially freedom now are transnational ideas.
Mm.
You can have people rallying around the flag of freedom anywhere in the world, and they can share their experiences. They can share their talking points. They can stand up for the same things on Avenida Paulista in Brazil or here, I don't know, at Washington Square. So the interesting thing about this is that the far right has come up with this very smart way of gathering movements and people from all over the world, because they do not reduce their rhetoric to national superiority, even though this element is very present. But they say basically it's not about the nation. Nation should be preserved, of course, and boundaries should be protected, but it's primarily about the relationship between the individual and the faith, the relationship between the individual and his or her family, and the relationship between the individual and his or her capacity to speak freely and, of course, to offend freely and to make aggressions freely and so on and so forth. So that's, in a way, a very strong point of these movements. So there's a transnational element to the rhetoric of these movements that cannot be, understated at this point. And this is what makes the far right so broadly organized and so strong in many parts of the world. We thought once that the capacity to organize different movements belonged to the left, right? The idea of a socialist international, the idea of many left-wing groups coming together, NGOs in the 1990s, and all these transnational movements that appeared back then. But now the far right has become much more efficient in organizing these groups under the slogan of God and family and freedom, because these are really transnational motives that somehow lead them to adhering to this movement altogether.
Perfect. So lastly, and just briefly, I wanted to ask about Javier Milei in Argentina, because there's various contradictions we've already touched on. The way that the Bolsonarista right in Brazil, ostensible nationalists, see their national interests as being submission to the US. And then with Argentina, the case is a little bit different, but there's also a sort of contradiction. Javier Milei is a libertarian, whereas Trump's instincts on political economy are rather different. It's the use of politics and state power to pursue certain economic outcomes rather than allowing everything to the autonomy of the market. And yet Trump now has just announced that he's going to be trying to bail out Argentina to the tune of some $20 billion. So how do you read that relationship?
Just as a side note, you know that Eduardo Bolsonaro was the one who called Trump when he was with Milei, after Milei won the elections in 2023. He was the one to, build the bridge between Trump and Milei. And ever since then, Milei has become a very avid Trump supporter, very loyal to Trump. He goes to those CPAC conferences. He even took the chainsaw and gave it to Elon Musk earlier this year. So I think that loyalty has paid off in this case because, of course, now Trump is willing to throw a lifeline to Argentina under very unusual circumstances, because the United States is not really willing to help anyone out. And now Argentina is being aided by the Trump administration and by the IMF, of course, which is in many ways led by the United States. So there's a lot of politics there too. Now, when it comes to Argentina, let me just say two things. First of all, there is this personal relationship between the two presidents. I know that Trump probably doesn't care about Milei as much as Milei cares about Trump, but to secure an ally in South America is also very important. Argentina is maybe today the third largest economy in South America, but it's still a very prosperous economy. China is also willing to, get into the Argentinian productive sectors, and Trump doesn't want it to happen. So there might be a geoeconomic reason as to why Trump's helping Argentina out, because he doesn't want China to do it. He doesn't want to open up room for the Chinese investments to bail Milei out at this point. So this is one aspect. That's the most obvious version of the story. But there's a second story to that, which is, in many ways, Milei's policies are a laboratory of things that Trump also wants to do in the United States, right? He's a protectionist when it comes to trade, but he's very libertarian based on some sort of Christian nationalist worldviews. He doesn't want the state to be in the way of, his very Christian and very anti-immigrant policies. So the idea of a chainsaw, the fact that Milei gave it to Elon Musk at a CPAC conference, is very meaningful, because at the time Elon Musk was leading the Doge department, which was basically to do what Milei was trying to do in Argentina. So to bail out Milei at this point is also to save face of whatever policies Milei is trying to do back home. And of course, Milei has suffered several setbacks, from corruption charges to, his recent electoral defeat on September 7th in the province of Buenos Aires. So the political situation of Milei is not really looking good. So by bailing him out, what Trump is basically saying is, well, there is a way for Argentina, and this way is through the hands of an anarcho-capitalist.
Hello friends, you've reached the end of a sample from an episode only available to subscribers. We put out 2 episodes a month for free. For access to the rest in its entirety, please join us at patreon.com/bungacast. For $7 a month, subscribers receive original, exclusive episodes with the entirety of the BungaCast cast. That's George Hoare, myself Alex Hochuli, and our contributing editors, Philip Cunliffe, Amber Lee Frost, Catherine Liu, Lee Jones, Alex Gurevich, and Lee Phillips. We've got extended interviews with guests, episodes on current affairs, and original episodes on theory, history, and culture, so as to understand the crises of our times. We also have the BungaCast Reading Club, where Phil, George, and myself present the key books and essays necessary for understanding the world today, how we got here, and where we might be going. Subscribers also get a digital subscription to Damage magazine, with whom we're partnered, and you can find all this info at patreon.com/bungacast. We do hope you'll join us. These are turbulent times, and ideologically confused ones as well. What we try to do is find political clarity, to move beyond the decadent age of bunga bunga.